Uh, I'm going to introduce Candina first of all. It has a very interesting and very diverse background. And what I really like about Candina's background in particular is she's been a practitioner of marketing. She's applied her skills to events at scale, and she's done that in an organization which is literally at the forefront of these technologies. And so who better than someone who can speak to us on all of those different levels about how Gen AI is transforming marketing. Candina has built her career over 20 years, leading scale-up businesses, significant transformation projects across many, many countries. Most recently, she was the CMO of Microsoft here in Asia, and has had many roles in a very long career at Microsoft across commercial areas, across marketing areas, and various other things like that as well. She's an Australian national, she's an athlete, a runner, and advised many organizations in the sustainability space as well, so something that she's very passionate about. So, without further ado, what is it? Tell us more about Gen AI.
Well, where I would start, I think we started talking a little bit about this morning where, for those of you in the room, but one thing I wanted to emphasise is the fact that this has been around for quite a long time. And so it falls into the scope of data science, and so which originated around 1950s. And so it's been starting to be embedded in processes since then. And I would say from a Microsoft perspective, we've been, I mean, you would have seen a lot of the announcements coming from tech companies, but most of the tech companies have been building this and adopting this for a very long time and working with a large set of customers around the world doing the same. And Accenture is like one of the big partners in that, as well as a lot of others. And some of you in the room, I'm sure, have also been involved in that. But practically, we've been using it internally in our own marketing processes for probably, I would say, more than 10 years now. So outside of engineering, but in basic like sales and marketing and building that into what we've been doing. And the easiest way that I would explain it is essentially it really enhances data. And so everybody's using data all the time for all different things. And it's literally a way of improving your data set to give you better insights, to give you better content, to give you an enhanced experience with data in general. And so that I won't go into a ton of depth now on that. We'll get into that in a minute. But its simplest form, it's literally just an evolution of how you think about data.
Fantastic. So we promised that we'd make this session very practical, right? So we're not going to spend time on the theory of Gen AI and some of the underlying technologies. What we're really going to talk about is how it's being applied, how Candina in her career at Microsoft has applied Gen AI in a number of very tangible contexts, and some of what that meant, how Microsoft did that, how Candina did that, the role of data and various other things. So give us an example, a very tangible example of how you've used this, and just talk us through how it was used and how you brought this to life and integrated into what you were doing at Microsoft.
Yeah, I think I'd frame this up in a few ways. So I think because of ChatGPT and the focus around content at the moment, I think everybody has been going towards like the final outcome stage of generative AI. But I think where we would want to start, and where we have started, is with the actual getting the right level of insights and the right level of data in the first place. And so typically within organisations, there's data living everywhere. So typically it will be quite fragmented, living in different places. And the first thing that we worked on doing is literally getting the data together into a source that allows you to actually then learn from it, or learn the machine to learn from it in the right way. And it doesn't just start with the data. There is a lot of development that goes into that as well. And so we'll talk about workforce and jobs and that sort of thing in a moment. But the data and the quality of that data eventually allows you to get to level of hyper-personalisation. So I'd start with hyper-personalisation. And I'll give you an example of this. When we went through digitisation of the events platform during COVID. And so first big global event, first cab off the rank from the big tech companies, is the developer conference called Build. And this is where the CEO of the company and a lot of the technical team share all of the new innovations, and then it goes through Amazon and Apple and everybody. They do the same sort of process. But normally, if you think about audience, it's predominantly a US audience, probably 70% US, 30% rest of the world. You get into this sort of, and you kind of have very finite sort of target audience groups, and you're working with a set of data and targeting for these target audience groups specifically. You come into COVID and all of a sudden you have this opportunity to access the world. And so say you have 6 main audience targets, you have a few different country targets, you've got like a target audience set of, double digits. All of a sudden you multiply that by 130 countries, you have a target audience set of multiple countries, multiple audiences, and then you start gaining greater access into students and in regard to people who aren't able to travel for financial reasons. Like there's so many different audiences this opens up to. And so when you start triangulating decision-making around that sort of data set, it gets a little bit kind of, tricky. Like how do you actually get people to the right level of content? And so what the AI tooling does is it then allows you to break that down in a more simple way. It allows you to pivot your different audiences by different countries. It allows you to do all of those things based on the input that you're getting as well throughout from a demand generation process, for example. So if you're going and targeting so many audiences, how do you actually think about that? So data in itself allows you to get to that level of insight, and that's where the personalization comes from. And so it doesn't start with the cool graphics and that sort of thing. It just starts with getting your data clean in the first place and really grounding in your target audience.
And so in that, let's stay with that use case for a second. So the application of Gen AI to data, to large unstructured data sets, specifically around hyper-personalization. What lessons did you learn? What worked well there? What didn't work so well? Who in the organization did it? Were people's jobs replaced? Or is this a tool that people used in their everyday lives in terms of what they were doing already?
Yeah, so it definitely involves a lot of developers, and so we're talking about jobs again. So it's like you still need people to feed the engine, and that requires a ton of development work. And so even a tool like ChatGPT now is helping developers code, for example, because there's a ton of work that's needed to actually process and feed that level of data into the engine in the way that you need. And it's not like, you start a new process and the engine automatically knows that you started. You also need to tell and brief your development team and brief the engine on what it is that you're looking for as the business decision maker or as the business owner. So you need to be clear on what you need as well, briefing your teams. And so it just becomes way more strategic in terms of how you think about the data and the people who are developing that data. I think what I noticed is, I think there's, especially with new processes, it really holds you accountable as a leader for really getting clear on what you want. Because what I've noticed is there is a tendency to brief in a very non-specific way, especially when you're trying to determine what it is that you're trying to do, and that can take teams sideways very quickly. So I think what this kind of helps with is really getting to the discipline of really briefing your teams on what you need in the first place, which then enables them to input that into the engine, which then gets you to the right output. And so there's this whole debate around whether you need humans or not. You absolutely do to get to the right outcomes. Otherwise, you don't get to the right outcomes.
Okay, so that actually, although in some ways it's an example of the outcome of a process, actually you see it more as an example of more time being spent on insighting, on ideation at the start of the process, which then has knock-on effects to how things are delivered in a more personalized way later on.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if I look at one of the skill sets that I've been working on, so when I was in the US, I had a engineering and data team, and one of the things that I had to learn, because I didn't come from there originally, was how to brief my data team. So it was like, as a leader of the process, what do I say to my data team to help them out and not confuse them and get to the right outcomes? And so that was a skill set I had to develop, which, it takes time. Anytime you're learning new things, you have to give yourself a bit of grace, trial and error, you get there eventually.
Let's talk about content production, because that's another extension of that personalization, right? I mean, just being able to produce the sheer amount of content that you need to take advantage of a personalized opportunity, right? I mean, it's only personalized if the content is actually personalized ultimately, no matter how much you know about the individual. Talk to us about that. I mean, there's a lot of people here in the room are interested in content as well, not necessarily in the marketing context, but many other contexts. How is Gen AI driving a step change in some of that content production?
Yeah, so I think leading on from the hyper-personalization point, it's like, and going back to jobs again, it's like if you want to satisfy that many audience types, you then need to increase the content production for that many audience types. That's the reality. And so then the engine enables you to extrapolate that out. I think the biggest challenge that we had more than anything was language. So you go from like a couple of, target languages through to like 130 potential languages. There's a lot of room for error in that. And when you're having like an event experience with especially if you hear something wrong in your own native language, it can really impact your opinion of everything that you're hearing. And so that was one thing, like we use the AI engines to do closed captioning and other things. And also, speaker translation. It's getting to that point. And there was we had a lot of feedback at the beginning in terms of things that were wrong, things that were not the right way. We had to go back and do a few languages like the traditional way and then come back again. But as the engine evolves, then it learns and improves. We learn and improve along the way. So never starts out perfect, but I think trial and error along the way is okay.
And in that context, how are you seeing creative teams working with the technology to make the most of it, right? I mean, where in the process does it come in typically, right?
Yeah, so I think originally we would be in a situation where the creative teams would start with the creative, which is fine. I mean, there's also an element of, you need to do what you feel, right? In those sort of situations when you're being creative. But one big change that we saw was the creative teams started using data a lot more to inform their process. And so I'll talk about the data and then I'll talk about the actual creative itself. So the teams had like an aversion to using data. It was like, it's going to stem my creativity. I'm not really like a data person. It's almost like there's a left brain over there, which is data, and there's a right brain over there, which is me, and that I don't do that.
I mean, that's an age-old thing in agencies,
yes,
right? I mean, the data. So you're saying Gen AI is resolving that conflict.
And I'm not a left brainer. I'm a right brainer for sure. But I use the data to help ground two things, I would say. Ground the way that I think, and help me to process it in a way that is more easily broken down. And the other thing it does is it allows me to talk to leadership and others within the organisation that I need to get budget from, or I need to convince, in terms of how the outcomes are actually going to impact the business in the right way. So I don't get my budget cut. I'm not the first person where, if times are tough, my budget goes, but the salespeople stay, that sort of thing, right? So I think at the beginning, the data team, the creative team were hesitant, but then if there's so many tools that allow you to break down the data in a way that is easy to understand, and as soon as they learnt that, going back to the learning point, they were fine. So that's the first thing. The other thing I would say is there's the actual creative itself. So gaming developers and others have been using similar tools to what's becoming available more broadly now for a long time to develop. The amount of content that you need that goes into that. I'm sure there's people in here who are involved in that industry. So there's a lot of work that goes in there. They've been using the technology for a long time to help that process. Now there's a notion of a couple of things, which is trying to, they say, democratize IT. So essentially all the tools that you would only be able to use if you were heavily skilled, in that area are becoming more accessible for everyone. And so therefore you can create more. Anybody can create more because those tools are being released, and they're being released in a way that is more easy to use. And ChatGPT is a very good example of that.
Yeah. I want to come on to the one last example before we move on to some other topics, which I do want to get to because they're important, right? It's not all roses. Business impact, right? And we've talked a bit about marketing, but especially in the event space, which again a lot of people are interested in. The leads and the application of Gen AI to the sales and lead process that comes after marketing. Where are you seeing the opportunities there?
Yeah, so this is something that has been worked on for a while, but it doesn't actually have, like, if I look at B2B lead generation, for example, I think the industry best practice is around 30%. And what I mean by that is, if you're in a call center and you make 10 calls, 3 of those are going to be accurate, and 7 of them still aren't accurate. And this is based on a lot of years of work in terms of, getting to the right level of data generation. But I think it started at 3%. And there's a lot of people who are still working off that number. So that's a huge, cost in general if you're not getting your data to the right level for something like that, for example. And that impacts all industries. Anytime you're doing any sort of sales, biz dev, any sort of process like that, this is an important application. But what the AI does is, if you're getting to so say, for example, if you go to an event and you have a lead coming out of that event, and typically, you kind of put it in some sort of system or a spreadsheet or whatever you're doing, and then somebody calls somebody, it's not necessarily an active lead, or it's not actually necessarily something that is going to be 100% useful. But what the AI engine does is it can also look at every other interaction. So if you assign customer IDs and things like that, you can look at every other interaction that customer or that company is having in a broken down way, and you can then feed leads in that way. And so what that does is that gives you a much more accurate view of whether that person's actually likely to be interested or not. If they went to an event and they saw a white paper, for example, it increases the propensity of a qualified lead by about 20%. So it's actually, all of these sort of things, it's like you think of the amount of time that you would save based on these sort of things is just, and even then it's still 30%. So there's a ways to go in the quality of the data itself in the first place.
So it leads nicely onto a conversation of who, right? I mean, we've touched on a number of different stakeholders across these different use cases: personalization, content production, lead scoring, and the sales process and salespeople. Obviously, a lot of the platforms that organizations are using today anyway, the content management systems, the CRM systems, whatever it might be, are all investing heavily in these tools, right? So my question is, what skill sets, right, should client organizations be developing in order to make sure that they're using these technologies in the best possible way? Right? I mean, they're going to be natively built into pretty much everything they're using as tools. So what skill sets does a client organization, a brand need to invest in? What skill sets does an agency that acts on their behalf but doesn't necessarily own the platform need to be investing in to be successful here?
The first thing I would say is, starting with data. It's like, if I look at an agency, for example, I would go to an agency and hold them way more accountable for understanding end to end what's going on from, customer acquisition through to the sales process, and being more, cognizant of what that takes. And also I would be happy, to use my customer data within, guidelines and that sort of thing, if they had an engine that helped to track that, for example. Like, if I didn't have the resources of a Microsoft behind me, that's what I would want, is to be able to go to an agency and have like that full service view. But I think in terms of the skill set, definitely the developer side, developers aren't going away. There's going to be more development needed, not less, because as you get to hyper-personalization, you will need more development to feed the tool in the right way. It does start with the human. The second thing I would say from a business perspective, it's at least a basic understanding of things like prompt engineering. So what are the right commands that you put into a tool in the first place that will generate the right sort of content coming out of it? And it doesn't mean it's going to completely replace everything. Like, you still have to get to the right level of tone and that sort of thing. It may get to that level of sophistication in the future, but right now, absolutely not, and not in the more immediate future. And I would say, like at Microsoft, for example, there are things that we were launching which were new, like hadn't heard of before. And you try and type a website for something like that in ChatGPT, it's not going to give you the right content. And so there's definitely, but it will give me an element of the content that I need. So, but I definitely need to give it the right prompt. So I would say prompt engineering is a big one. Creative teams understanding how to work with existing content and tailor it for hyper-personalization, which means creative teams need a better understanding of data. I don't see content going down in terms of production. I see it going up as you start to get hyper-personalized. So I think it's more, I would say just more comfort and understanding and knowledge around the data, like in general. So don't even think that you need to start from scratch anymore. It's like, what do you do with things that exist and how do you make the most of what already exists? And I think we do that now already, to be honest. Like, there's a lot of, you get inspiration from things already. Like, there's not a lot of times where someone has a truly original thought. There is also collective conscience of society. We already do that. And so it's more the data's giving you a framework for how to actually just leverage that more efficiently.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I mean, one of the use cases we're seeing is on the content production side, is content reuse, is being able to retrieve content from content management systems in a much faster way, in a more granular way. And so actually content that you've invested in the past has a much longer shelf life. So to your point, you don't have to go back and reinvent the wheel every time. You can use these technologies and manage the database that way.
Yeah, there's so much content. So on the events side, we literally had more consumption following the event than during the event itself. And so having the right system for people to be able to easily access and find that content is a big deal. The other thing is internally as well. Like, we did our whole thing internally. We have this massive, you think about learning and that sort of thing, we have this massive like database of learning, which is also leveraged internally and externally. And I think internally, maybe 10% of the content was accessed. There was 90% of content which was never accessed.
Yeah, we're seeing a huge...
Yeah, seriously.
Very small.
Huge.
We've got 3 minutes left, and there's one topic I wanted to talk about. Can we just go to the last slide? You guys can put up the last slide. We've talked a lot about the positive... the next one, actually. Click on it. We can just go to the next slide. We've talked a lot about the positive parts of this, right? And I think there is the organizations we're working with, there is a genuine excitement around the opportunities that Gen AI presents, no question. I was reading a recent study actually done by BlackBerry, which said that 72% of organizations, I don't know why the number stuck in my mind, but are actually banning use of Gen AI, certainly in some contexts. And it's easy to see why. I mean, this is just a list of some of the things which are, we sort of talk about responsible use of Gen AI, right? Because of copyright infringement and plagiarism. Obviously, there's a lot of concern amongst writers about, all the content they're putting on the web being what's feeding the beast, right? Confidentiality of data. I know a lot of the platforms are responding by creating sandbox environments so that you don't share data which is proprietary or confidential to your organization and still be able to use these. Things like explainability, right? Especially when you need to understand why certain things are being recommended. Bias is a big issue, right? And there's something very, very important to you. And also regulatory compliance, right? I mean, so there are many potholes on this road. What do you recommend people do to manage this well, right? Because, I mean, it can't be a free-for-all, right? I mean, even if it perhaps started as a bit of a free-for-all, the processes are being put in place where, as the 72% stat shows, the guardrails are being put in place. What do you suggest to make sure that it's responsible Gen AI, not just Gen AI?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is, and how I think this has been approached so far, what I've seen is what have you already done for precedents? So GDPR, for example, or there's a lot of if you're in the music industry, what do you do already with DJs? It's like there's a lot of frameworks already that exist around content, and it's a function of using those similar governance mechanisms in order to ensure that you're approaching it in a similar way. So I think it's hard, like if you're going to shy away from it completely, if it's gotten out of control and you have to shy away from it, that's unfortunate. But I think it would be quickly putting in place those frameworks that you already have and that already exist for other things. The other thing that I would, and this is what's happening already, the other thing I would say is in regard to confidentiality and security and that sort of thing. For example, Microsoft's actually embedded ChatGPT in all of the programs. So every single Microsoft program has it embedded. The reason for that is, yes, it's a great kind of addition, but it's also great from a security perspective, because the applications and the implementation of those are already protected within, the security requirements within organisations and other things. So it's like, if you have the right governance processes, use what you already have and apply it, versus trying to start net new with generative AI. It's not a net new, it's just use what you have.
Perfect. Well, in the great tradition of keeping this conference on time for the first time that I've been involved in it, I'm going to say thank you very much to Candina. I think it was
Thanks,
great insights, and thank you all very much for listening. With that,